Welcome everyone to the seminar on storytelling and climate change. The stories we tell about the climate crisis matter. A story is cause and effect. It makes a shape out of reality. It helps us understand. And a story is something that we can pass on. It's something tangible. Stories are not the property of creative writers. They belong to everyone. They are hardwired into every aspect of our culture. The 2020 report of Climate Story Lab UK, which was produced after discussion with over 100 climate experts and storytellers, argues that we need a biodiversity of storytelling as diverse as the ecosystems we seek to save. In her novel Autumn, Ali Smith writes, "Whoever makes up the story makes up the world." And Venetia Welby, author of Dreamtime, argues that writers can say what others cannot, can explore hypotheticals and reach something true. Everyone has a part to play in halting the juggernaut and hauling it round. Inertia is death. Or, in the words of James Bond in his latest cinematic outing, if we don't do this, there will be nothing left to save. It's a challenging prospect. As George Marshall, founder of the organisation Climate Outreach, writes, "It is clear that climate change has few of the qualities that capture people's attention. It is distant, intangible, uncertain, and complex. It requires change and sacrifice, which people always resist, while lacking the clear external enemies that would mobilize them to accept such sacrifices in times of war." So where does this leave us? These are extreme times. There are distractions all around us. But if we can focus on our own climate stories, what nature means to us, what the future means to us, how we'd like to live in the present, then we might start to create new understanding and a collective energy. No one can do much alone. But together we are powerful, and there is still time to change the narrative and create a world that can sustain itself and human beings. This evening, I'm delighted to say we will be hearing from 6 people with different perspectives on the climate crisis and how we can begin to comprehend it. Each of them has a different story to tell, and each story is an aspect of our collective understanding. Rajat Chaudhary is a bilingual writer and activist. He's published fiction in English and Bengali, edited volumes of speculative and solar punk, co-edited stories from the Asia Pacific, and translated Bengali underground poetry and an early 20th century memoir of a mystery author set in Calcutta's back alleys. His most recent novel, The Butterfly Effect, has been listed twice by Book Riot US as the 50 must-read eco-disasters in fiction and among 10 works of environmental literature from around the world. He has been a British Council Charles Wallace Fellow at the University of Chichester and a Hawthornden Castle Fellow. Rajat engages with the climate crisis through his column for the New Indian Express, besides other outlets. The Cli-Fi video game, Survive the Century, features his short fiction. Based in British Columbia, Canada, Lisa Coulter is visiting researcher at the Sustainability Research Institute in the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. Her research focuses on methods to develop climate risk storylines, the intersections of climate knowledge, narrative communication and future thinking, and communicating information to support adaptation. During her 2018 to 19 MITAC Science Policy Fellowship with the BC Ministry of Agriculture, she developed a framework and user guide for climate change adaptation pathways to help communities and agricultural producers develop shared adaptation visions and goals. Lisa is contributing editor of the book Communicating Climate Change Information for Decision Making and co-author with Sylvia Arnold of an upcoming book supporting imaginative climate conversations. Tanya Hawkes is a climate change worker, writer, and academic of 20 years, currently studying the impact of gas infrastructure, past, present, and future, on working class communities in Britain. She is authoring a writer's guide to climate change out later this year. And Tanya is mostly interested in finding and telling the environmental stories of the working class and marginalised among us. James Miller is the author of the novels Lost Boys, Little Brown 2008, the cli-fi thriller Sunshine State, Little Brown 2010, and Un-American Activities, Dodo Inc. 2017. He has a PhD on James Baldwin and civil rights protest, and is a founding member of Writers Rebel and helps run Twitter for Extinction Rebellion UK. In his spare time, James is course director for the MA and MFA in creative writing at Kingston University. Stephen Peake is Professor of Climate Change and Energy at the Open University and a Fellow of the Cambridge Judge Business School and Senior Associate of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cambridge. He has worked at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, International Energy Agency, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Originally trained as a physicist, he holds a PhD in engineering from the University of Cambridge. Harriet Tarlow is a poet, an academic, interested in landscape, ecology, environment, and place. Her single author poetry publications are with Shearsman, Etruscan, and Guillemot Books. Her academic essays appear in book collections and journals as diverse as Chicago Review, Sociologica Ruralis, Critical Survey, Classical Receptions, Jacket 2, and Journal of Eco-Criticism. She is the editor of The Ground Aslant, an anthology of radical landscape poetry, Shearsman 2011, special features on eco-poetics for How To and Plumwood Mountain, and on cross-multi-inter-trans disciplinary practice for Green Letters. Harriet is Professor of Eco-Poetry and Poetics at Sheffield Hallam. So these are our 6 speakers for the evening. I'm not sure if Rajat has joined us yet, so I don't know. Ed, is Rajat with us?
I don't think he is at the moment, so I think probably best to move on to the next person.
That's
oh, in fact, he's just actually arrived.
Okay.
But I would say
let's give Rajat a moment.
Yeah, so, let's give him a minute.
Lisa, are you okay to start us off? Thank you.
Let's start with the sharing of the screen. Are you seeing what you'd like to see?
Yes, we are.
Looking good.
Lovely. All right. So future climate narratives. There's 3 words there, and they're all very significant because the work that I do is really taking a look at both how we tell about stories and the narrative communication that we have, how we talk about the future, and we now know that we have a future that involves climate change. So how do we pull all of those 3 together and have a conversation that makes sense? So I'm going to start by talking about narrative communication, and you can see an image there in the landscape, and we cite our stories in the world that we know. Then we talk about future thinking. So there's some an algae farm, something that could be bigger in your future than it was in your past. And then climate knowledge, showing a dry stream bed there. So this is one of the things that can happen with climate change. So do we focus on one or the other, or bring them all together? I've also put a little link in here to a book chapter about future climate narratives. It's part of something that was published in 2018. So when we look at narrative communication and future thinking and we draw them together, we come up with something that I call imagined futures. So we imagine the future and we talk about it, whether or not it's got climate change in it. So if we look at future thinking and climate knowledge and bring those 2 together, then we can think of that as an unfamiliar future. I'm thinking about the future and climate change, but I might not say anything about it. I might keep those fears to myself because I don't necessarily want to scare the kids or my partner or whomever. And then we take a look at dangerous futures. If we're looking at climate knowledge and we bring in a storyline around that, then we tend to have things that we call dangerous futures. What's the dangerous level? What are the dangers? It's a climate emergency. So I see this as a bit of a framework that we can use as we think about what we're writing, as we look at what we're reading, and we consider, where does it fit? Are we bringing in the future? Are we bringing in climate change? Are we bringing in our imagination? Are we really telling a story? So for example, if we take a look here at future thinking and the narratives that we might bring together with that and look at an imagined future, I've got a little vignette here I'll read to you. How did they meet? Cam's family are natives of the corporate community of Spiricom and proud of their work, comfort, and good health. Steeped in stories of how Aspie saves people from floods, fire, and famine, Cam is excited when they move to the algae farms on the border with their trading partner, the Nationals. Meeting Brody from the coastal nation was a crazy accident that started a lifelong friendship and a new understanding of both their powers and responsibilities. So here we have just the seed of a story, just the very beginning, the sort of thing that you could give to somebody and say, where does it go? How does this story flesh out? But this is an imagined future. Now I've got another story for you where we're looking at narrative communication, the stories that we tell, and climate knowledge. How do we bring that into our stories? And I call this dangerous futures. So this little story is called Turning the Corner. The water bucket tangled as Maeve trudged down the hill, resenting the burden of her brother's chores. Logan shouldn't expect her to do all his work, no matter how hard he was studying to get into the academy. She did miss him when he went off to boarding school, but loved having their parents all to herself. Turning the final corner to the stream, her stomach clenched as she saw the dry riverbed. Remembering stories of the big drought, Maeve turned and ran up the hill. So here we see a narrative, a story, climate knowledge, not necessarily thinking about the future, but definitely thinking about the past and concerned with what that might be. And as a third version, what we've got here is climate knowledge and future thinking. That could bring us into those unfamiliar futures, things we haven't seen before that might be unprecedented, but we won't necessarily be talking about it. Flying solo. In the fierce heat, it was a matter of pride that Aryan Farms deliver on time to the processing plant, despite the short window when planes could lift with a full load. After many training sims, May and Will would control one of the big cargo gliders delivering the harvest. Dad had checked all the calculations to balance lift and load to make sure they could catch that natural mountain updraft that caused them to decide where to farm years ago. Saying nothing, they hoped they were up to the task. So these are stories about people. Always the stories are about people. It's the characters that draw us in. This is what we're interested in. But really, when we look at how this all fits together, this is a little bit of a framework that might be useful as we're going forward and thinking about what we're talking about, how we're talking about it, and how we're imagining the future. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Lisa. Rajat, would you like to do your presentation next? Do you?
Yes, sure, I can do that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I miscalculated the time, and so I joined a bit.
Oh, don't worry at all. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So thank you for inviting me to this very interesting roundtable where we are discussing how stories, whether stories can change the world, and if so, how they do that. So let me first tell you a bit about where I am right now. I live in Calcutta, which is about 100 kilometers from the Bay of Bengal coastline. And for the last 2-3 weeks, we are having cyclone warnings. And one of these cyclones, it made landfall about 800 kilometers south of us. But then 2 other systems formed. And we are having constant torrential rains for the last 2 weeks. A city was inundated for 2 days, and all the adjoining districts are now flooded. About 2 million people have been affected. People are dying. Buildings have collapsed in my city, old buildings built during the British times, where usually, poor people from other states take refuge, or they stay here looking for work. Sometimes these people can also be climate refugees, or because of work opportunities, they're coming here and staying. And these buildings collapse because of the rain. So you see all these things are coming together, 2, 3 cyclonic systems, poverty, migration. And I was thinking, we always think of these things now, how difficult it is to put all of this in a story. And this is what we'll try to grapple with in today, I think. So without wasting any more time on the backstory, let me just dive in because we have about 5 minutes. I've broken this up into three questions, my little talk into 3 questions, which are why stories, what stories are we talking about, and how these stories really impact us. I will be mostly quoting from research and my experience. So why stories are important? We all know that. Stories are vehicles of information. They inspire us, they motivate us. They are kind of sticky, they remain with us. There is this anecdote quoted in Storytelling for Sustainability in Higher Education, the new book, about people who were at a conference together and they told each other stories which are related to the theme of the presentation. And some years later, when 2 of these participants met, they couldn't remember each other's names, not their affiliations, but the stories were still fresh in their mind. So that gives an idea how sticky stories are. And to come to our future might look like. And stories also help us visualize transition pathways to this future, which is very important. There can be 4 or 5 different pathways depending on how much fossil fuel is burned, whether we take a green road, how much education, how much investment is made on education, health, and things like that, whether countries fight each other, whether there are more dictators or more democracy, and things like that. And all these pathways can be made more visual, can be vivified with stories, and can even help planners to work towards the future. So that's why stories are so important. And then let me look at why these stories are important. What kind of stories are we talking about? We all know Amitav Ghosh has written quite a bit about it. He has talked about the failure of the imagination. He has brought in Bruno Latour's ideas about the partitioning project of modernity, where nature and culture went their different ways, which is why the culture is not very prepared to grapple with climate change. But then again, science fiction and other hybrid genres have been able to do that. So all these things are there. And another important commentator in this context is Gregor Sanderson, who has these 5 imaginaries, 5 different kinds of climate stories, where he talks about social breakdown, judgment, and several others, sphere, loss of wilderness. Another important concept that Gregor Sanderson brings from Heidegger and Freud, of course, is the uncanny in climate stories, in 2 kinds of climate stories that he divides. One is social breakdown and judgment. In both of these, he finds the presence of the uncanny, though different kinds of uncanny. Another intervention in this is Nick Adamson's, which is kind of a slightly activist proposals, the 6 proposals for the reform of literature in the age of climate change, where he talks about doing away with progress-based narratives, retiring the single soul, and several others. And he also says that literature should be more than a matter of personal ambition. He connects literature with personal ethics and things like that. So all of these give us an idea what kind of stories we should be telling our constituencies, we should be writing, because there can be several kinds of stories. There might be novels, there might be stories that NGOs tell their constituencies, and several other stories that educators use. So all of that. And finally is how these stories are working. So there are several studies being done on this. Like people like Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, Abel Gustafsson, then Dennis Baden, and several others are studying stories, how these stories are working. Mostly it's fiction, mind you. And it has been found that these stories do elicit dramatic emotional responses. They help people picture potential futures, but mostly these stories are having more impact on liberals rather than conservatives. And these stories have helped people from changing their position from cautious to concerned, or from concern to alarmed vis-a-vis climate change. It has also been found that these repeated readings of these stories have more impact. Character identification is very important in these stories, which is true for any others, which is true for the persuasiveness of any other story. Also, transportation of the story is very important. And then, of course, a very common thing we hear nowadays is about hopeful stories, and studies have found that positive stories, of course, inspire more people. Stories of hope, they inspire more people. So that's very important in climate messaging. But very interestingly, personal stories of real people, they even have an impact on conservatives and moderates. One study has found, even if they are about worry or compassion, these personal stories lead to a change in belief and perception. So focusing on personal stories is also very important. And finally, to bring it all together and try to answer the question that we are asking, let us think about this, the wheel of a ship that the helmsman uses to navigate it. And there are the spokes of the wheel. So stories are just one of the spokes. We need science, of course. We need activism. We need alliances. We need community. We need policy. We need politics. And all of these together can only change outlook, perception, values, and finally change the world for the better towards a sustainable pathway. So that's all I wanted to say. And I will engage more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Rajat. That's brilliantly succinct overview there. Thank you. The next, Tanya, can you join us next? Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Sorry. I'll just try and share my screen. You can watch me be bad at IT for a second. Hopefully not. Just. Oh, Ed, I might be struggling a bit to share my screen, but I don't know why.
Okay, Tanya.
Sorry.
So that's all right. So when you're going to share screen, what are you seeing?
Sorry about this, everyone. I'm just seeing something that says desktop 1 and whiteboard. And
yeah, do any of those have the content that you like to share on them?
No, they don't, which seems odd.
On your desktop, maybe.
Yeah, is that what? Sorry, everyone. Is that what desktop 1 is? So would I click that?
Have a go at clicking desktop and then see if you can find it from there.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can see your desktop now, and then
okay.
There you go. So I can see your PDF there at the top, I think.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just finding it hard to move things around. How about that?
That's great. We can see that now.
Does that show a slide which says whose stories are we hearing in climate fiction?
It certainly does.
Yes, it does.
Sorry, everyone. You'd think by now I've been using Zoom for so long, I'd probably be better at this. Sorry. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's just like, this is pretty much my favourite subject. And so I'm really pleased to be able to talk about it with everyone. So just, one of the things that always comes back to me is whose stories are we hearing in climate fiction? And I think it's because, so just a bit of a personal story, really, like about 10 years ago, I was asked to write a piece of fiction and a piece of non-fiction for an anthology. And I'd been really immersed in the climate policy world for a while. I was working at the Centre for Alternative Technology. I've been working there for a couple of decades. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And so there was the non-fiction piece, which was about the technology and the policy, and then the fiction piece was supposed to bring that alive. And what I realised, really, so I attempted this very kind of globe-trotting short story about the climate change policy and the international process and migration and all kinds of other really ambitious things. And it was a bit of a it's one of those things like when you're thrown in the deep end, you realize how difficult something is. And I quickly realized how hard it is actually to turn a subject as complex as climate change into a story, into a compelling story, a readable story. You know, and I'm constantly amazed by the authors that manage to do this, of which there are many. So climate fiction became a bit of an obsession for me since then, and particularly in terms of how authors are managing to turn really big subjects like global climate policy or biodiversity loss into, you know, into stories, and all the forms that stories take with the plot and the characterization, and managing to make it look kind of natural. You know, and I think, you know, stories like Ministry for the Future, like by Kim Stanley Robinson, and very ambitious works like that have managed to do that in, you know, in interesting ways. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down for my next slide. And one of the, and I love those big globe-trotting, big ambitious stories, you know, the science fiction and the very expansive works that people come up with, but stories like Snowpiercer and Aurora, and, you know, I think they're really ambitious and really necessary. But I think one of the things I'm interested in, and I'm always really pleased when I find stories as well that kind of narrow down to the smaller parts of the climate story, I think. And one of the phrases that really leapt out to me recently, Matthew Schneider Mayerson, I think you mentioned him, Roger, you know, so he writes a lot about climate fiction, and he wrote this critique of some climate fiction. I think he was writing a critique of The Odds Against Tomorrow, which is a great book, but he was critiquing it and saying that he called it disentanglement from communities of place. And it really resonated, because he was talking about the protagonists who could relocate easily, they could pay for transport, and their relative wealth gave them a certain resilience to the unfolding climate crisis that was happening around them. But while others who were less central to the story were, you know, less able to react to the crisis. And I think, you know, very much people who are very much entangled in their communities of place. And to me, these are the more interesting stories, I think, you know, the people who don't move, the people who are less resilient to shocks, you know, the elderly, the disabled people. It very much resonates with my family and where I come from. And, you know, what happened, you know, what is the climate story for people who perhaps, you know, don't have this kind of ability to react to, you know, the climate crisis. And, you know, and I think those kind of stories will help us move away from like the lone hero narrative and a bit more to the stories about the interconnectedness of society, you know, like the health and social care systems and food supplies and land changes. And, you know, I think one novel that does that well is Water by Lloyd Jones, who has written a climate story, you know, set in Wales, and it weaves in parts of Welsh culture and language. And, you know, it's very much people who are fixed in place and dealing with a crisis. Like, it has big themes in it too, but I'm, you know, I'm interested in those stories. And I think I just, so back to me personally, after attempting myself to write a fiction story and realizing how hard it is, you know, and I definitely want to read those big stories by other people who are good at them. But I think I'm looking for the smaller narratives now, you know, the ones that involve talking to your neighbors about what our lives might look like when we can't use petrol cars anymore, or, you know, what will change around us in our communities. And I think, you know, a group of people I've been talking to recently are people in the coal mining communities in South Wales, looking at, you know, talking to them about what their life has been like in the transition from like coal to forestry. You know, there's a big transition happening there, and it, you know, it's changing employment and, you know, everything about their landscape and people's culture and their memories. And I think you know, we can draw from these stories, and then we can imagine new worlds from them. And yeah, imagining worlds from the bottom up in a way. And I think I just want to end with this quote from Laurie Penny, which definitely wasn't about climate change, but occasionally when I've been working on climate change, you know, you end up thinking that stories get deprioritized as a form, as if, you know, it's maybe not as important as the science and the technology and the policy. But, you know, I always remember her saying, you know, stories are about the myths and fables that save us from despair, and they're, you know, and it's only a story, but it's only the most important thing in the world. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Tanya. James, I think you've got a couple of films as well. Are you able to go next?
I am. Let's just have a go at sharing my screen as well. Okay, let's see, where are we at? Hang on.
Tanya, can you unshare?
What I need, hold on. I keep losing my, I'm not in the right window, sorry.
You okay? Do you want a hand, James?
Yeah, the top toolbar keeps hiding my windows, so I can't choose my right window. Hold on, if I just adjust it. Okay. I'm sure I can do this. Come on, I can surely do this after.
You can definitely do it.
Oh, you see, it's up there. I need to be able to I need to be able to get my right windows up. Okay. Nah.
It might be, James, that when you selected to share your screen, you selected one window rather than the whole desktop.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing just a second.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Oh, don't we just love technology? Okay, let's try again. You're getting a good example of my kind of classes, which there is always some kind of technological farce takes place during them. Let's have another look. Okay, here I've got the right screen. I can't promise there won't be more technological farce as I ambitiously try and negotiate between 3 short films. But what I'm going to do really is tell a story of art and activism over a weekend in June. The art and activism started on the Friday, where the group I helped set up, called Writers Rebel, staged an event called Paint the Land. And it ended on the Sunday with an Extinction Rebellion protest connected to our Free the Press campaign, where we're calling out particularly the Murdoch media for kind of underplaying and kind of denying the gravity of the climate emergency. And in many ways, I'm kind of interested in how art can be used to kind of not only spread awareness and kind of raise, if you like, consciousness about climate emergency, but also disrupt the powers that be. Because I think, you know, one thing that's often absent from some of these quite genteel conversations that we have in kind of academic and sort of artistic forums is the fact that we're under a very repressive regime at the moment with Boris Johnson, with Priti Patel, in which protest and actually increasingly kind of artistic expression is being kind of criminalized. And we have a government that is talking the talk, but not really acting the act in terms of addressing the climate emergency, and is in fact doing all it can to kind of suppress attempts to draw attention to their inaction. So I think that's something we kind of need to keep in mind, and this will be made kind of more relevant with a couple of the other clips that I'm showing. But we started off on Friday with a Paint the Land action. And the idea behind this was to take a kind of a high-profile writer, in this case Ben Okri, well-known artists, in this case an artistic duo called Ackroyd and Harvey, who particularly work with kind of living materials. For example, they kind of grew the artwork. And kind of bring, if you like, words and pictures together into a kind of inspiring, or in some sense kind of meaningful kind of configuration, just to, again, to help people take notice and think, I suppose, going back to what Sally was saying at the start, capture people's attention and try and kind of capture some of the sort of media agenda about this situation. So first, I'm just going to play this sort of short film that encapsulates this Paint the Land action that we did.
Earth that we love is in grave danger because of us. We have raped her, exploited her, abused her, destroyed her, wrecked her, disemboweled her. We blow her up, we blast her apart, we smash her, we detonate atomic bombs on her, we poison her. Can you hear the future weeping?
Today marks the launch of our nationwide project, Paint the Land, in which writers and artists will create their own literary graffiti in the landscape. Because if governments and tax-evading corporations and the fossil fuel industry still aren't getting the message that they need to act urgently, we need to tell them in words big enough for them not to miss.
We think of the planet as almost inanimate, as solid and fixed, but it's not, it's all in motion. Whether it's the bacteria in the soil, the worms moving the soil, we are part of nature, and we need to learn to love that. We are in the last days of history as we know it. We are at a terminal point. It's either death or transformation. Our love must save the world.
Can you hear the future weeping? Our love must save the world.
So that action which took place outside Tate Modern, that artwork had been grown and exhibited inside Tate Modern, and then it was, as it were, kind of symbolically carried out and floated in the Thames. And don't worry, it wasn't left in the Thames. It was taken out again at the end of the day. But while this was happening, something else was taking place, which was that now I'm going to have to go through the same shambles again of trying to adjust my screen. But while that was happening, bear with me again, sorry. Yes, while that was happening, the Extinction Rebellion art factory was raided. And the artists inside were arrested. They were arrested for painting banners. Now, this was a preemptive assault by the police because they knew that we were going to carry out a protest outside Rupert Murdoch's HQ. And again, Extinction Rebellion, as I'm sure you know, carried out a very controversial action last September where we blockaded News International print works. And there's considerable kind of evidence that Priti Patel was phoned up by Rupert Murdoch, and that Priti Patel then phoned up the Hertfordshire police and kind of lent on them very heavily to bring that protest to a close. And when those protesters were being tried in court, the defending QC tried to get the phone records between Priti Patel and the police released to the court. And yet we were told that due to a mysterious technical hitch, all records of this conversation had somehow vanished. Apparently the police all chose to update their mobile phones, and all records of any such conversation disappeared. But here we see the dangerous subversives in the Extinction Rebellion art factory under arrest.
This other lady, you going to tell you? Yeah, it's fine. You put the mic and the pixie down. So, if you give me your mic. I was going to say, if you give it to me off, we'll put it on the back. Do
you know if Shell's okay? Seems like protests illegal. And they were bored. You know, here we were, paintbrushes in hand.
Indigo,
and
then,
Indigo,
jump in the van, please.
There they are, waiting here for us. Goodness gracious.
Jump in the van, then on the van.
Yeah.
Can we just give her a quick one? Yeah. Let's give you a good one.
On the way.
Pop down the side of that.
You think there'd be better places to search, wouldn't you? Things that are more important than stopping people just getting on with a bit of environmental protest.
It's called up to the safety switchboard.
No, not you, I mean the whole operations. How many police are here for us painting our banners?
Oh, I see. I don't know.
You know, it's a bit bonkers.
I just tried to
like
vanish.
actual crime
Would you
going
mind just
on.
jumping in, please? Mind your head, mind step. Thank you very much.
So as we can see, this this dangerous radical was apprehended by the police and artistic equipment was kind of seized. So this took place simultaneously while the Paint the Land event unfolded. And obviously we got it out on social media. And as you can see, it created a kind of small social media, well, quite a big sort of social media kind of media storm. Greta Thunberg was amongst those who retweeted this. And this bit of footage, as you can see, was viewed well over 500,000 times. I think the tweet itself was watched, was seen by well over 1 million people. And so we're in this context of art, not just as something to kind of console us or something to kind of raise our consciousness, but how can art actually disrupt? How can art actually kind of contest the kind of power structure? And it's worth pointing out as well that the police didn't just raid the Extinction Rebellion art factory. They also raided the Anti-Pavilion art warehouse, Anti-Pavilion being a kind of an art studio. And they raided it because on the roof of the Anti-Pavilion warehouse, there were some of these bamboo structures that are similar to the sort that Extinction Rebellion have used to kind of carry out blockades. They raided that warehouse with around 50 riot police. And then when the owner of the warehouse turned up to ask what was going on, he was dragged off his bicycle and promptly arrested himself as well. And now the weekend kind of ended, as I said, with this protest outside Rupert Murdoch's News International. And it was then that we had a kind of final, I like to see like little twist on this sort of theme of a weekend of art, protest and kind of action. And as we jokingly said it, this was our submission for the 2021 Turner Prize. So in a sense, what we have there is a little bit of abstract expressionism in action, in a way, in which, again, washable, non-toxic, non-chemical paint was briefly sprayed on the offices of Rupert Murdoch's News International, and the activists who did so rapidly apprehended and arrested by the police. And certainly one of our kind of principles is that we don't avoid arrest. We are accountable for our actions when we break the law, and we expect to be we expect to go to court and be held accountable for it. And I suppose what I want to leave us with thinking is that, we need to tell stories that also kind of disrupt and kind of challenge the power structure. And perhaps as well as kind of artists, writers and academics, we perhaps need to move ourselves out of some of our kind of comforting silos as well. We're naturally quite conservative people, writers and academics. We like to kind of not get involved in these messier things, but I'm no longer sure that just sort of telling stories, just writing poems, just writing essays is quite enough. Obviously, these things are important and we need to do them, but we're in a kind of a crisis here. We need to step up. We need to kind of take action as well. We need to do things that aren't just going to speak to people who agree with us, but that kind of challenge and confront the powers and draw more attention and more kind of media attention onto what is happening, so that the media and politicians are forced to talk about these issues and forced to kind of think about them in a way that perhaps they don't normally do so. So that's me for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was very fascinating and stirring to see those films. Stephen, would you like to take the hot seat next?
I would love to. Thank you very much. And thank you to the speakers so far. Amazing contributions so far. And as they go on, I think it gets harder to add to what's going on because it's been very rich. I'll try. I think I'm here this evening because I've, in a sense, I've led my own protests for 30 years in my public speaking, teaching, policy work around climate change. I've lived my life through this story. I mean, I joined the UNFCCC Secretary, the Climate Change Secretary, just after Kyoto COP4, and I'd been a policy wonk and a teacher and a public speaker and a coach and a leader, leadership training, etc. I'm an academic mainly. One of the things that I've experienced through my life is, and I'm a scientist originally, is this turn, this twist, this pivot that for a while in the noughties, we all thought that the answer to the skeptics was more science, better scientists, clearer, louder, more honest science. It was just more science, just pour more science on it. And gradually, I think, whether we knew it or not, as communicators, we saw that that just wasn't working. And when you do face-to-face teaching and work and training, as I've done, particularly training of corporate leaders, you realize that they're not particularly present. You're doing your very best, and they're not particularly present, and you can blame yourself. You can say, what am I doing wrong here? Why am I not getting a visceral reaction to this knowledge that we are discussing today? And why can I not believe my own audiences? Is it because I'm a crap communicator? And maybe that's true. But I experiment. But I also witnessed, particularly, corporate leaders at Cambridge would gloss over, fall asleep in a science lecture, but you give them a piece of frozen ice that's 10,000 years old, and it bubbles and it cracks and it melts, and they can put it up to their ear, and suddenly, or get them to touch a little suit of a polar explorer, the fur on the collar, and suddenly they realize that behind these science graphs are people and objects and uniforms, and suddenly they're alive and it becomes real. So slowly began to understand that if I wanted to, as part of my work, to try and engage audiences, it was something about embodied whole person learning. And that isn't just about science, it's about doing other stuff. And I suppose that's how I slipped into understanding a little bit, a tiny bit, about the power of narrative and embodied learning. And so I began with just trying to just shake things up with guided fantasies, asking people to think about videos instead of essays, bringing objects, drama techniques in class. I got very depressed at one point in this career, and signed up for some stand-up comedy classes, because if I was doing my job correctly, I was told that I had to leave my audiences in tears, and I wanted to actually make them laugh. So that was an interesting twist. And then combined with sort of leadership development work that I'd been doing over a period of time, I suppose I became familiar with some of the more immersive experiences that people can do if they're looking at leadership and personal development, the rituals, the narratives that are incorporated in those kinds of courses that try to create leaders. So there's some artistry which goes into there. This is sort of search for meaning. And the story, of course, is whose stories, as some of the speakers have said, but very importantly, we need to create 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it keeps growing, I'm afraid, into the century, a billion individual stories that somehow make sense at their level and then can make sense at a societal level. And I suppose my foray into the world of narrative culminated, it continues, but a notable point was when I seemed to agree in a sort of naked fire pit dance on Exmoor that I would create a Edinburgh Fringe show which would try to bring these science ideas in the format of a 50-minute Edinburgh Fringe thing, to sort of see what would happen there. With Philip Woodford, my partner, we wrote, produced, funded, and performed it, and that also told me and helped me learn a lot about the value of working more closely with actually professional writers and people who work in this field professionally. And it's all well and fun for scientists to say, I'm going to have a go at storytelling, but there are professional, just as professional plumbers out there, there are professional storytellers, and along the way they've got involved. But it really, this idea that narrative is important is just as important as throwing on the very best science that we can give. And that I have realized very slowly and very powerfully over my 30 years. I think that probably is 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Again, a fascinating new kind of angle into the subject there. And so finally, Harriet, would you like to step up?
Thanks, Sally. And many thanks for inviting me. I've enjoyed everyone's contributions. The alphabet is against me as ever. I'm going to share my screen now. And this set of slides is just going to roll along behind me. It's from various projects that all took place in taking place actually in northeast Lincolnshire on the coast. But I'm going to talk generally around the main issue we're talking about today, and I will end by mentioning specifically this project, which hopefully the slides will start moving along. I'm a poet, I'm an academic, but I do listen to and tell stories in my work, as this PowerPoint shows. And I believe in the power of stories to understand, to imagine change, and also to foster resilience. But the key word here is listen. And this is the word which forms a bit of a challenge, perhaps, to the phrase used to advertise the event, which obviously is just a strapline. I'm not kind of laying into it too heavily. But this phrase, discuss ways to communicate climate crisis messages to wider audiences, assumes that we as writers, artists and academics in the humanities know what we're talking about. Do we? Do we really? But it also assumes that we are the communicators, the creators, and the others are the wider audiences or the general public. They're the listeners. And I think we can't really afford to have that distinction anymore and to think about people in that way. I think everyone has to be a part of this struggle. And that's why, I mean, a lot of the things I'm going to say are quite cliched, I guess. And that is a bit of a cliche, but it's actually true. And it can only be done in terms of listening as well as talking. And I also feel that all the best scientists know this. In fact, that little talk that Steve has just given is really an illustration of how someone grows through their career in listening to more and more different kinds of people from different areas. So this morning I was sitting down in my shed to start work, and I was delayed for half an hour by Jim Alkalili and Hannah Cloak. I don't know if anyone heard that. She's a professor of hydrology at the University of Reading, and this was on Life Scientific. And what a great example she was of someone who could talk about flood and models of flood prediction in a way that anyone could understand, but who also realizes her own limitations. She worked with a poet, Maria Ferguson, to write a poem about her feelings and thoughts about water. She said, "Oh, I don't know anything about poetry, so I worked with this person." She understood that not everyone can see in their head, as she can, maps and models of water moving all over the world. She understood that it's not just about conversations with the delegates to COP26, but about speaking with people from all disciplines, all walks of life, and all places that's important. And I'm going to come back to place at the very end of this little talk. So water. As a lover of water, which Cloak also is too, I was pleased to say, I wish that I could see in my head, as she can, those maps and models to understand flood in relation to climate change and all the other anthropogenic and social factors that feed into these problems. But the only way I can is to talk to other people. So in the last year or so, I've been in a network called Hydrospheres based here at Hallam, but involving people, quite a lot of people from different places, but particularly the leader of that network, John Bridge, the environmental geoscientist who is based here. And in conversations with him in particular, I've been able to explore the River Don's catchment area and the hydrology of this area. And also on the ground with fellow poet Kim Martindale, I've walked the reservoirs of South Yorkshire and traced them back up to the becks and rivers on the moors above, and then back down through post-industrial sites, under shopping centres, through waste treatment sites, into Sheffield and out on the other side. As part of a supervision team with John and another chap called Kev Spence, who's a specialist in water engineering and environmental science, we've supervised a student called Crystal Morley, who's exploring attitudes to climate change in this catchment area through a Q-type model and extended interviews. She's starting with wild swimmers. They're people with a real investment in water. I know that because I am one myself. And they're a really interesting place to start. So she's working with various different groups one by one. And Kim and I have also talked to people and plan to do so more now that COVID makes this easier, from bottle collectors to activists to artists to farmers. They all have an investment in water. We've written a collaborative sequence of poems which tries to capture all of this and also tries to inhabit the journey and the perspective of the water as it moves through the area. Oh dear, I was doing so well until that point. I was sounding so reasonable for a moment there. But the thing is about creative work is that we can engage in radical imagining in creative work. And to my mind, the more radical the creative work, or the poetry in my case as a poet, the more it can do so. Hence the title of my anthology that was mentioned in the introduction by Sally there, The Ground Aslant Radical Landscape Poetry. This could include the inhabitation of other perspectives, human or more than human. And there hasn't been much mention of the, the wider, more than human world that isn't just us so far today, I've noticed. And also the imagination of possible futures. And obviously science fiction. I didn't talk about science fiction or novel because I knew there were novelists on the panel, but there's another way to do it, obviously. So what's the point, really, of experimental endeavour if we don't make this act of radical imagination? And I think that's true for the science and the arts. And how big really is this famous art-science division? How useful really is it anyway? So the interpretation of data is always the telling of a story. And so all scientists will tell you that once you start to speak to them. And then suddenly, these divisions start to break down. So climate change, just to end thinking about place, climate change is a temporal phenomenon, but obviously its effects are felt in place. So I conclude with place, and it always comes back to place. However attached we are, however we try to foster place value, places are never just our own. From our own little micro hamlet to the whole wide world, they are shared with others, the human and more than human. And if we don't recognise this, I think, excusing the pun, the danger deep mud at the end of my presentation there, we're completely sunk. So in my more long-term projects that you've just been looking at in the PowerPoint, we've worked on little tiny areas of salt marsh, coast, defunct canal in northeast Lincolnshire. We've talked with people who live there. And my feeling about that is that they know what it's like. They have the thoughts and feelings about place. They are not, in fact, they are us. They are experts in their place. And I think when we all stand together in a gallery or a local canal warehouse or a community centre or a library or beside the salt marsh to explore art, poetry and environment, we can have conversations that can really get somewhere in relation to thinking and being motivated to act about climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Harriet, and thank you to all 6 speakers for those brilliantly varied and rich talks, which I think are incredibly thought-provoking, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience. We've got half an hour left. If you have questions, do put them in the chat box, and if we have time, we'll answer as many as we can of your questions to any of the speakers. We also, before the seminar, asked the speakers to supply a question for the panel to consider. So I'll take some of these. We'll see how we go with time. So, we will try and leave space for audience questions as well. So we'll sort of take it from the top again and start with the question which Rajat had for the panel. Rajat, you had a question about the borders between literary fiction and other genre writing. Do you want to say a little bit about that question?
Yeah, I have it written down here, I think. So what I wanted to ask the panel was, is climate change finally blurring the borders between literary fiction and other genre writing? And will this better serve the purpose of communicating the climate crisis to a wider audience?
Thank you. Lisa.
Yes, I had an immediate response to that, which was the audience doesn't care about our genres. So we as literary people are very interested in it. Publishers are interested in it. But I've got a feeling that the more you try to reach a broader audience, the more the genres themselves don't matter so much. But then that folded in on science fiction versus fantasy. So if we're going to keep it scientific, if we're going to keep it plausible in the real world in a heated environment, that's one thing. but can we come up with a vision of the future with climate change that doesn't include, pixie dust, which is sort of net zero by 2050 pixie dust, because, that's not an option. It's not actually even plausible. So I think that when I look at those genres, I come into fantasy science fiction genres and wonder about that. So.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And as I wrote a Cli-Fi novel all the way back in 2010, it's one that's quite pertinent to me. And that novel was a kind of a sci-fi dystopian, and it kind of replayed a lot of the dystopian sort of tropes that have kind of define a lot of the Cli-Fi genre. But it's interesting that back when I wrote that novel, I wasn't quite sure when it was set. It was set sometime in the nearish future, but I couldn't quite tell when. And since it was published, it seemed like the future and the reality of just getting closer and closer. So when I was writing it, I was thinking, this story is probably set when I'm dead. And now I think, no, this story is set when I'm still very much going to be alive. And I think, too, that climate change, if we think about the kind of dialectical relationship between sort of art, narrative, and kind of social reality, climate change is changing all of this social reality. So I actually think that almost all of our, and it's not the only change on it, but it's the strongest change. And so I think that almost all of our kind of categories of sort of genre, and particularly the kind of wider category of what we might call realism, are all under kind of enormous sort of stress as a result of climate change and a number of other factors. And I think that they're all going to need some sort of kind of rethinking. And certainly in a more kind of positive way, I would hope that would also sort of liberate some of these genres as well. So science fiction is no longer siloed as one particular thing, literary fiction no longer siloed as another particular thing, but that they can be kind of brought together in a kind of productive dialogue as well. Because, change is happening. It used to be the case that, fiction could predict the changes, that fiction was at the vanguard, and we need to stay at the vanguard, otherwise we're going to be kind of left behind because things are changing very quickly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. Harriet.
Yeah, I was thinking that what Lisa said was completely true, that basically the public really don't care about that anymore if they ever did. But also that actually when you look at a sort of co-creation exercise in which people sit together and play around with scenarios from science fiction, that they write very much sort of back into their past and then into their future. And they can think about changing the story. And I think another sort of buzzword at the moment, which I think is quite important, is climate anxiety, particularly with young people. And that if you can get them having those kind of workshops where they actually feel they have some power to write stories and create stories and think about different stories, they can think about changing the story, and rather than feeling apocalyptic all the time, which is a real danger at the moment, particularly for young people, I think.
Thank you. Tanya, did you have your hand up? Yeah, Tanya. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Just really briefly, because people have probably said everything that needs to be said. But because I was thinking this about, genre. Where is climate change in genre fiction? I've been trying to seek it out, and there's some great YA novels out there that are appearing. But also I literally just read a novel, and I won't give any spoilers, but it reads like a historical novel, but it's a climate change novel. So that was really interesting. It was by Robert Harris, The Second Sleep, I think it's called. So that, and I didn't really, and I read it thinking, this is a historical novel. And I was like, oh my God, no, it isn't. And so that, the ability to bring climate change into.
Is that newly published, Tanya, or is that an older novel?
Gosh, I don't know.
Right.
I'll put it in the chat in a minute. Yeah, I think it's quite new, yeah.
Harry, is your hand up from previously, or did you have to say something else? Yeah, that's fine. Thank you all. So I'll move on to the next question, which is from Lisa, which is about imagined futures. Lisa, do you want to pick up that question that you put to us?
Yeah, I had focused on the word unprecedented because it keeps being pushed forward into our face. And Rajat, you've been involved in flooding in your city and the implications of it. this week. And so one of the things that happens is we get these events that are never before experienced in human civilization since we've had cities. And so as we go forward, trying to imagine something, it turns out when you think about the future, the part of your brain that's activated is memory. And so, yes, you ask somebody a question about the future, the first thing they say is, yeah, well, what I remember is what we used to do was, what my mother told me was, and any new invention has to be connected to the old, right? First printing press, everything looked like calligraphy. You know, we will, so the question is, how do we go forward and imagine a future that's unprecedented when we have to connect everything that might happen to something that we already know? Go.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Rajat.
Yeah, actually, there are two answers. One is I can share my experience. I recently worked on a video game, which is about climate pathways, 5 different pathways. And there were 4 of us writers there who kind of wrote stories for each of these pathways. And in doing that, what we were doing, we are not only sitting in our rooms and imagining the future, we were working very closely with scientists and climate activists and policymakers. We had a number of quite serious workshops with them so that our stories were very well underpinned in the science and we could imagine what will happen. This video game is about the next 8 decades, what will happen in every decade. And you play the role of a newspaper editor, one of the most powerful newspapers in the world. So by picking the news, you change the zeitgeist. and the player plays that, and there are several pathways that he or she might take depending on what the choices he makes in that game. This game is called Survive the Century. Anyway, it's a free game, you can get it online. So in working on that, I discovered that you need scientists very close to you when you are doing this kind of fiction. So that's the experience part of it. And theoretical part of it is it has been discussed by Anderson, Gregor Sanderson, I mentioned his name. He talks about bricolage and mimesis. Bricolage is when you take things from the past, Noah's Ark, all those stories, Babel, and put bits of that in the story, and then you mimetically evolve it. You use a bit of science also. Most of the climate fictions that he talks of are done in this way. He kind of, I can give you some examples, like this story Far North. He links it with the story of Babel. Then day after the story, the novel Swarm, Franz Schadzin's novel. He links it with Noah's Ark story, the flood and all that. So he talks about taking a bit from the past, as you said, future and memory, taking bits from the past and then using your imagination and partly using science to predict what might happen. There will always be mistakes. In designing a video game, I was looking at how much the water level might rise in Washington, because there is a scene there where there's an Ethiopian restaurant which is sinking, and it's the last restaurant standing in Washington. Much parts of it has gone underwater, but that restaurant is still over ground because the water level may not rise so much in that area of Washington. So yeah, we can do that. That's one way to do it, I think.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to Lisa?
I hope it's a response. I personally find I think all of us on this call, all of us, the speakers and the participants here, all of us probably think about climate change probably more than average. That's why we're here today. So we're not typically an average audience, and of course the speakers have thought about climate change a lot more than average, and so have I throughout my life. But as one lives professionally, if I'm a teacher and a scientist and sometimes a writer, but not a creative writer very much, whatever you are, but if you're thinking about this all the time, and you're thinking about the futures and thinking about this hyperconnectivity between the past and the future, and this sense of seemingly being asked to work together to try and save the world, it becomes really quite tiring. It becomes really quite exhausting, really quite draining, the idea that the human and the non-human world all have stories to tell. They all have voices. I mean, I picked a stone up by the shore just yesterday and was talking to it about its geological history, its geomorphological history, which part of the riverbed it had been in the last 10,000 years. And I just thought, I'm going mad. Or sometimes if we're talking about net zero, that troublesome word net, that net means actually I'm going to carry on doing mostly what I'm doing, and somebody somewhere else is going to sprinkle some magic dust and my bad is going to go away with their good. Well, it turns out that their good, that magic dust, typically is nature-based solutions at the moment, which means it's trees, it's carbon locked up forever as a result of the credit that you've just purchased. So if you think about it from the soil carbon or the bugs or the leaves or the trees, and you start to kind of try and put all that together and envisage what does it mean to be sustainable in the future or to save the world, I personally find it a totally overwhelming sensory experience. And so I think if we're wishing more and more people to think like that or experience the world like that, I'm not sure it's a good thing. It's just sometimes also nice to go back into nature and just feel and experience the awe, and don't be too thinky about it. Well, that's how my own experience is at the moment.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. We'll move on to the next question, I think, which is a question from James about the type of action. James, do you want to pick that one up that is most effective?
Can you remind me of my question again? Sorry.
Yeah, you it relates to your presentation, I think, this sort of questioning the role of a writer, I think, in a sense. What type of action is most likely to be effective in driving change among the structures of power and vested interest that exist between politicians, banks, and the fossil fuel industry?
Right, because it's like, what can we do to incentivize or disrupt them in order to actually make them change? They're quite happy for 1 million Cli-Fi novels to be published. That's that's fine. That doesn't affect them one little bit. But meaningful change isn't going to happen unless they are either incentivized or disrupted in some way.
Anyone want to respond to James?
Yeah, can I?
Yeah,
thanks. Yeah, sorry, James, I feel like that's the question I've been thinking about for 20 years and I don't have an answer. In fact, the longer I've worked on climate change, the less I feel like I have an answer to that. But I did want to mention maybe two things that I just think that have made me feel really hopeful about kind of narratives and storytelling and climate change, even if they're not going to overturn systems of power. But and one was the Wales Future Generations Act, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, actually, and it's worth checking out, really groundbreaking piece of legislation in Wales, kind of very first of its kind, which, but the reason I link it to this is because I noticed one of the things they've done, because it's like policy and it's an act of parliament, but they've got storytellers employed, they've got video makers, they've realised that to make that policy real, they've got to bring in people with imaginations to start imagining a future, because it covers so much, because having the well-being of future generations as the boundary of your policy means that you can't just do it in the way you've always done policy. You've got to have people in there, creative people who are imagining that future. So I think that was really interesting to me, that marrying up of policy and storytelling. And the other thing recently was I mentioned earlier about, doing a bit of research with some of the, talking to some people who are in the valleys in South Wales and the coal mine communities, and their landscape really changing. But they were doing an exercise of what will our area look like as it transitions away from fossil fuels. And they did this gorgeous, beautiful piece of work with the local community and lots of children. They called it Imagine My Valley. And it was very much that. It was what will our world look like? And it was like, you know, the people that live there who've seen so many changes happen, you know, and it was like, what were, you know, how will it affect us? What will we be doing? What will our jobs look like? What will our transport look like? What will, you know, and I know that doesn't solve the whole power question, but they were two things that on a kind of smaller level felt significant, you know, for making change happen.
Rajat. I think you're muted, Rajat.
A very difficult question, actually, but there are 2 or 3 things that comes to my mind. One is, of course, on-street activism, which XR is doing very much, like picketing the banks and things like that. Another group to engage are the customers of the bank, to talk with them, to use stories with them, and every other technique that you can think of. And finally, another thing that comes to my mind is this whole thing about transition, you know, niche change, regime change, and landscape change. So when a bank is in trouble, when the economy is in trouble, it's a good time to look at the other ideas that are floating around, like green banks and things like that. And this is the time when we can push for legislation that enables these other models that do exist somewhere and let them move up from niche to regime and maybe later regime to landscape. That's the way how change happens. But it's not easy, but it can be done. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Harriet.
Briefly, 2 things. I think actually, James, you actually showed direct action, and that is one of the ways, isn't it, quite clearly? And I think it was really useful having those little films as part of this, you know, I thought this was really diverse, actually, this set of presentations, which was great. But also, I think a lot of us are educators. And, you know, we're educating people who may end up to be quite powerful themselves. I know we don't have a lot of time, and I know that there are all sorts of barriers and problems, as in, you know, you can't actually send your students straight out onto the streets. But you can, you know, help them understand power structures and make them feel that they could be powerful, that they could become active in some kind of way. And that thing of understanding how power works, I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's that easy. And I don't think we're encouraged in our society to understand how power works, which is why in your presentation, I was really interested in how much emphasis you put on the media, you know, and the relationship between media and politicians. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, Lisa, yes. Lisa, you're muted, I think.
Having worked like Stephen with the scientific community for quite a while and doing communication, they didn't used to stop environmental protests because we were irrelevant, insignificant, and ineffectual. This is your new badge of honor. You're dangerous, visible, and something to be fought against. That's progress. And so when we look at the changes that we want to see in the world and being the change you want to see in the world, it's messy, it's ugly, and you have to lose an awful lot to transform into something very, very, very new. I keep thinking of a caterpillar and a butterfly, and I can tell you it cannot be comfortable to have every cell in your body reorganize itself. That's not going to be a fun process. And so as we look forward and we think about the changes that are coming upon us, because the climate is changing, these changes will happen, they'll be bottom up, they will not be organized, top down, even controlled things. It's going to be ugly, and there will be certain losses. But if you give up the hope of the things that can't possibly happen, the pixie dust solutions, then you actually have room for some joy and some pleasure in things that really can happen. But I think it's not so much like accepting a medical death sentence. It's much more being told that, okay, mate, you're going to have to lose the leg. We can save you, but you're going to have to lose the leg. What? It's totally unacceptable to have all these losses unless it's the only thing you can do to save the thing. Don't try to save the planet. It'll do fine. It'll be here. But compassion, kindness, if we can navigate the next few decades with grace and compassion, that'd be an impressive achievement. So that's where I go with it. Not the techno fixes, but just the human behavior. Can we actually have some appreciation for the others in the planet? we are a part of nature. We're just an organism like all the other organisms. And we need to give ourselves a bit of a break and embrace our fellows. Anyway, that's mine.
Thank you. That is inspiring thoughts. If the last two speakers don't mind, we might just have a look at, given we've got 7 minutes left, the audience. Ed, is there any questions that you want to pick up on in the chat box in particular? I think I've seen a couple of comments and a question about publication somewhere.
Yeah, there were several really interesting discussions going on, very dynamic stuff in the chat. Lots of comments. Alex said earlier on, really interesting point made by Tanya about not being able to or not wanting to leave a place. There's so many narratives that are driven by quest or geographic movement, which leads to questions of different kinds of narratives. So not heroes' quests, perhaps. So I thought that was really interesting. Charlotte asked, during the anti-nuclear movement, there were groups like Teachers Against Nuclear, Bikers Against Nuclear, etc. And all the groups came together in the marches, as I remember. Is there an umbrella organization like this now, or is Writers Rebel where artists and writers come together against the climate crisis? So a good practical question there, if anybody wanted to answer that.
That might be James's.
James,
yeah. Yes.
Well, there's a few. There's also, groups like Culture Declares an Emergency, Culture Unstained, more other groups that are kind of more focused on disrupting, say, the sponsorship of art exhibitions by oil companies like BP or not BP. Writers Rebel, we're really just a small group. We're just a small group. But anyone, we're a small group, and we're kind of an affiliation group with XR. So wider Extinction Rebellion would be the time when all the groups kind of come together, because you have doctors, lawyers, scientists, all sorts of regional, local groups kind of all coming together for big actions. So not exactly. But we'd really kind of, as Writers Rebel, urge, yes, no music in a dead world too. There's architectural groups as well, but I guess we'd really kind of urge writers to form your own sort of versions of Writers Rebel in your own kind of local communities, or kind of affiliated to universities or other kind of organizations that kind of might support you. We definitely don't kind of claim ownership of it. We're merely kind of a platform to try and sound the alarm more urgently through the kind of writing and sort of literary and artistic community. And I suppose as well, actually persuade more writers and artists and academics that perhaps they need to go a little bit further, that it's not quite enough to just write a nice poem, but actually we need to get out on the streets as well.
Thank you. Any other comments, Ed, or any other questions? I think I saw one about the publishing industry from someone a while ago.
Yeah, that was a good comment. I don't think I can find it right at the minute. Right. I know the one that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Rosemary had a question for the speakers, which is a nice general one, which is it more powerful for stories about the climate crisis to end on a note of hope or despair?
That kind of reflects on what Elisa was saying, wasn't it, to an extent? And anybody else want to pick up on that? Hope versus despair. Rajat.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in my talk also. If we look at studies, yes, most of the studies show that hopeful stories are more powerful. They influence people more. But what I have been thinking is despair or grief can also have an effect. Like if you read Jim Bendel's deep adaptation paper, there he talks about, grief, the power of grief in religion. Like if you think of the Buddha, these sights that he saw, a dead person, a sick person, a very old man, he left his home and then he founded a world religion, which helped many people. We can suppose. So similarly, sometimes grief and despair can have a very powerful impact. Also, genre readers of genre are very prepared, are very ready to filter out, the dystopic elements of fiction and get the message that's there. So that way, I will talk about both. I will support both. Hopeful stories are of course important. It works for most people, but sometimes, dark stories, dystopian stories, and all those stories can influence change, even radical change.
Thank you. Harriet?
I think actually you were getting there, Rajat, just as I put my hand up. But yeah, I mean, all good stories have lots of feelings in them, don't they? I mean, all good stories are going to have both, and all poems, of course, that's the great advantage of them, is that they have a multiplicity of possibilities coexistent at the same moment, which I think is, I'm just smiling at James's daughter, which I think is important, you know, and that's getting away from kind of binary thinking and being more subtle about things is exactly what, you know, art, writing, literature can do, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you. And Tanya?
Thank you. Yes, oh, which one got me? Yeah, hope and despair. I just think, I mean, yes, Roger, you know, I think you said most that needs to be said. I was just gonna, there was one thing that really helped, obviously having worked on climate change a long time, you know, you can get pretty despairing, but there was some work done by Ro Randall on, I think called Carbon Conversations, and she does a lot of work on just how to have you know, because it can feel like a lonely place when you know a lot about climate change. And she does this amazing work on how to just have everyday conversations with people, like in the supermarket, without getting like upset when they don't believe in climate change, or, you know, how to just have nice, productive little chats. I think it's so useful, because then you don't feel like you're in this kind of isolated space, and you also don't get defensive, or where you learn not to, and you just learn to like just have these little chats with your neighbours, you know, and I just feel so important.
Yeah.
For a bit of hope.
I think that's a great point. And I think the organisation Climate Outreach that I mentioned at the start is very much into that thing of how you have conversations, and this thing about not preaching and not being, you know, people don't want to be preached at.
That's where my partner works, actually. So
is it? Oh, right. You know all about
that. So we obviously talk about climate change a lot.
You're always having those enabling conversations.
Yeah.
So I think, Ed, unless we've got any other questions that are from the audience, we might conclude. How is it looking from your end?
Well, we're about at 7 o'clock, aren't we?
Yeah.
Sally, so it might well be time to wrap up. But
yes.
I would say that you know, we're going to try. Somebody made a really great suggestion to try and build a sort of little bit of a reading list from what the speakers have said today, and perhaps put that onto the Contemporary Cultures of Writing website.
That's
so we'll try and get
idea.
Working on that if everybody's willing. That would be fantastic. Great. I'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah. I'd just like to say a heartfelt thank you to this absolutely brilliant panel, and the sort of depth and richness that you've brought, and, you know, hope and despair in these discussions, and so many ideas which I think in themselves are inspiring. No matter how bleak the situation, we can see that collaborative and collective action and sharing ideas like this has got a significant part to play, and there is still time, and there are still stories to tell, and still so many more questions to ask. And I think one of the things, you know, from something like tonight is to, you know, it informs us with even more questions, which can't be bad. So thank you to this great panel, and as Ed mentioned, there will be information about this event online which you can pick up afterwards, and the talk itself will be available on YouTube, and don't know exactly when, but in the fairly near future it will be available. So thanks all of you so much for joining us this evening and being so inspiring.